Lawyers of Reddit, what is the most morally challenging case that you've worked on? Not me, but my brother is a criminal defense attorney. He worked as a contracted public defender for a few years after starting his own business to get some guaranteed income while building his client base. The catch with these contracts is you're not able to refuse clients. He had to defend a guy that had repeatedly raped his toddler daughter while the mom watched. When I asked him about how he got through it, he said, "When I get to a point where the crime is so heinous that I can empathize with my client, I switch my frame of thought from how will I get this guy reduced or no time, to how can I ensure this guy won't have a chance at a mistrial." So essentially, he copes by making sure that everyone from the police, to the jailers, to the prosecution team are 100% on the up and up so that when this guy gets found to be guilty, there's no way he'll get set free on a technicality. During my days of insurance defense, I spent one lovely afternoon bickering with counsel for a co-defendant over who would be responsible for paying the $5,000 that was keeping us from settling. We did this while on site at the plaintiff's home for a deposition. Plaintiff was hit by a semi-truck, i.e. the truck hit his actual body, on the interstate, and while it managed not to kill him, it tore off an arm and a leg, and shattered most of everything else. He was almost entirely immobile, confined to a power chair that he could barely operate, and confided to us that if he had function in his remaining hand, he'd shoot himself. Oh, the $5,000? It was based on an estimate to renovate his bathroom so that he could actually use it. He'd been pissing and shitting in a bedpan in the living room. I felt like a complete fuck sitting in front of him and arguing about such an insignificant sum. Family law attorney here. I've done plenty of divorces and custody dispute cases. That most stuff doesn't get to me. It's only when the kids are put in a bad situations between one or both of the parents being some type of addicts that really gets to me. One that was especially hard for me was a divorce where I represented dad. Mom was a raging alcoholic that would bring random guys home many nights from the bar while the dad was working. I saw video and heard phone calls from their little boy calling the dad at work at like 2 a.m. because he was tired, but couldn't go to sleep because mom was playing loud music and had friends over still partying. I was on the right side of that one. But seeing and hearing that stuff with the little boy really got to me. Did a bail hearing back in my second year of practice as duty counsel. Think public defender type role. The guy had trapped his girlfriend in the cab of his pickup, twisted one arm up behind her back to her shoulder and broke it. Then did the other side. I had to run the bail hearing for him. While she and her family were sitting in the front row of the court, she had both arms in casts and in slings. Thankfully, his surety, the person posting his bail, melted down on the stand and we had to adjourn. By the time he was up for bail again, he'd retained private counsel, who put the same surety up on the stand even after I warned him not to, in front of the same justice. Upside, he got detained. Not my case, but at a previous firm. A partner sent out a firm-wide email congratulating his team on a great win. It detailed how their win meant that our client, giant fossil fuel company, wasn't liable for damage to the environment caused by leaks in their pipes. Instead, the taxpayers would be covering the cost. The partner went on to say something to the effect of, "This saves our client $X billion a year in environmental cleanup and pipe maintenance." For some reason, even though it wasn't my case, that one has always stuck with me. Please don't ask for specifics. Had a case where a guy shot and killed a security guard that slapped him across the face for selling drugs near a store. I knew the guy had done it. It was close to midnight. The crime scene had poor lighting and the shooter wore a hoodie. Only eyewitness that showed up for the trial had told the police at the time of the crime that the suspect was black. The defendant wasn't Caucasian but wasn't black either. That, emo, was the argument that won the jury over. Defendant found not guilty. He thanks me while in tears. His mother and grandmother bring me cake and a thank you note afterwards. Less than a year later I'm watching the news and they're reporting a crime where a crew held up 3 families hostage while robbing their apartments. They beat up the janitor very bad. They tied the families up and locked them in one of the apartment's bathroom while threatening to throw a grenade inside if any of them decided to wisen up. For a brief second one of the robbers looks right into an elevator camera before spray painting it. Close up on the guy's face. I think you can imagine whose face I was looking at. Edit, to everyone asking, He was identified but never caught. Managed to stay on the run for maybe a year and a half and was later killed over some drug-related debt. Lawyer here. I once had to defend a guy that killed his own grandmother and rubbed his own fecal matter all over the corpse. It was bad. I represented a mom in a custody case. Both parents fighting for primary. Mom was admittedly a mess and suffering from some mental health issues. Dad took the kid and didn't bring them back for a few months, in violation of the order. I got the kid back. Then met with mom and kid and realized kid was doing way better with dad and should be with him. Tried to reason with mom. She didn't listen. Ultimately, the Child Protection Office got involved and child was placed with dad. I last saw mom many years ago and she was still not in a super healthy place and child was still with dad. So best ending happened and not because of me. Edit, words to make things more clear. My friend's dad is an attorney. He started out in criminal defense and lucked out on one of his first cases. A friend he'd known for years' wife was horribly murdered while he was away, dismembered with an axe. Her body had been found by a fluke, and there was a tiny bit of circumstantial evidence pointing to the husband. He was an upstanding citizen. The two had never fought. It was a silly case. The lawyer got the husband acquitted, and while they were having celebratory drinks, the husband admitted he'd actually done it. My friend's dad walked out of the bar and switched to corporate law. Not me, but a friend who studied law. They helped on a case where the father had shot and killed the mother of his children. The reason why he had shot her was because he was working abroad to earn as much money as he possibly could for his kids, so that they would never have the life he did as a child. He came back to find that she'd spent all the money on drugs and his kids were being abused. I don't typically do family law, but I have a case where we suspected the mother had Munchausen by proxy, which if you've seen the Hulu movie Gypsy, you know how messed up it is. The child was always fine with the dad, but mom would take the child to the doctor every other day. When they didn't give the answer mom wanted, she'd get a second, third, etc. opinion. Mom was oddly close to the nurses and doctors. Child had some type of cancer where child needed a colostomy bag and mom didn't clean it. It was infected so bad that child can't wear it anymore and child is getting more sick and dying. Mom, allegedly, pushed her child in the shower and it messed up their head. It's possible mom is feeding her drugs too because child puked blood from time to time. Now the child has seizures once a week from the shower incident. Mom spent $400,000 on medical bills in 1 year. Mom made a fraudulent GoFundMe and only used $200 of the thousands received on medical bills. The page has since been removed, and the case is still open until we can find more experts to testify. This is my first case and I'm currently working on it now, but it feels largely morally reprehensible, antitrust case where our client has been indeed manipulating the market in shorty ways. However, I'm not defending the client's practices, I'm merely advising him. Which means I tell him in pages of legalese to cut the bullshit because that shit will land you big ass fines. I've only worked as a legal intern, not a lawyer, and I cannot speak in specifics for obvious reasons, but I've dealt with about 8 child sexual assault cases at this point. I helped prosecute most of those, but played a role in the defense on a couple. I can tell you, either which way you're working the case, it's tough. Nothing is more terrifying than reading a young victim's description of being abused at the hands of a trusted family member. Not a specific case, but viewing child pornography was pretty uncomfortable. As a defense attorney, you would go to the prosecutor's office to view the discovery files as they're prohibited from releasing it outside the office. So you go in and sit down in a small room and a legal secretary brings you the discs with the files on them. On one case, I had to view the files more than once, so imaging rolling and saying, "Hey, need to see that kid's dick again, thanks." Also representing parents in juvenile where I was fighting to return kids to pretty broken homes. Most of the time, it didn't bother me. But in one case I represented a dad whose baby mama had just had these adorable twins. These parents were absolute shitheads. Now a lot of times, the foster families are one small step above the parents themselves, not people I would ever hire to babysit my kids. But in this case, the foster parents were a couple of 30-somethings who I presume couldn't have kids of their own. They would show up to court with the infant twins, and they bought them new dress clothes for each court date. So cute. They wanted to adopt the kids. Should the parental rights of the bio parents be terminated? So I felt pretty bad showing up trying to get the kids returned to the dad. I left that job before that case was completed. But I assume it had a happy ending. The judge was never going to return the kids to the parents. So I like to think the couple has them now. I worked on a merger between two large companies that resulted in essentially a monopoly that continues to screw over consumers, including me whenever I use their services, which most consumers are forced to. Legal, smart, and moral are very different terms which don't necessarily go together in legal work. Actions can definitely be all three. I think the toughest decisions are moral, legal, but not smart. The most morally challenging case is the one where a client has been wronged, but circumstances make holding someone to account too difficult or expensive to be accomplished. Telling a client you have been hurt by someone who did something illegal, but you can't do anything about it. Sorry, really sucks. Disclaimer: none of the below is legal advice. Don't take legal advice from randos on the interwebs. Bringing a medical malpractice action can be really expensive. Some states require you hire a medical expert to present certain evidence. Some states cap the amount of damages you can recover. I've seen some egregious behavior shrugged off because the probably at fault party knows that most people can't afford to bring the case. Every case is a big deal to individual clients. Losing, or getting a bad outcome, is never fun, but telling a client that someone is going to skate because it's too expensive feels morally worse. Ugh. Well, fresh after law school, I worked on a case where the people involved were sketchy in every possible way. My role was very limited. I was just helping with some securities filings. The problem was that nothing quite added up, and when I brought the discrepancies over to my boss, she just told me to put the information in anyway. She was very friendly with the client. We saw him at our office all the goddamn time, as he'd often just drop by to chat and hang. Years later, the company folded, in a manner of speaking, and their clients, many of whom were quite vulnerable, lost hundreds of millions of dollars. I was not at all surprised. My boss was someone whom I had dreamed of reporting for years, for that and other sketchiness, but she was slippery enough never to do anything wrong that didn't carry some level of plausible deniability. Additionally, I'd always felt like I had zero idea of what I was doing as a student and then first-year associate there. Further still, I felt powerless against someone who had built herself quite a reputation within the legal community here, and who had been known to act vindicatively toward anyone who crossed her in the past. In any case, I do think about that old file often. It's not the only one we worked on at that old firm that eventually blew up in a bad way. It's also really not great to feel like you may have helped legitimize an entirely, and to me, obviously, fraudulent operation. My experience there definitely jaded me quite a bit, even compared to other junior lawyers. I worked for a multinational crypto Ponzi scheme. My bosses were too dumb to understand the product, which clearly seemed pointless. Client flew us business class to several conventions to parade us, the lawyers, in front of prospective customers. My bosses ignored my repeated exhortations to drop them, but decided to be a little cautious and not publicize our arrangement with the client. Soon the scam unraveled, and we started getting calls from scammed customers saying that we heard from such and such that we are the lawyer, where the fuck is our money? It was finally then that my bosses decided to drop them. When I was about to start college back in the 90s, I took a legal receptionist job in a legal defense firm in my little southern town. I would work answering the phones until 1 p.m. and then after that I would tag along with one of the lawyers for a few unpaid hours and watch them do their jobs in court. Everyone was very nice and did me a huge favor because the experience gave me enough information to learn that being a lawyer wasn't for me. It turns out that I can't handle watching people be crushed by the system. I could handle the murder trials, drug charges, and real estate squabbling no problem. It was watching poor people get ground up over minor offenses or simple mistakes. Little things that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One particular case stood out to me. There was shooting and a crowd had gathered around the body. A detective was asking people in the crowd if they'd seen anything. Our defendant said yes, when he hadn't seen anything really, but he just wanted to help. He was a simple-minded person, but never formally diagnosed with anything, largely due to the lack of services in my town and the fact that he dropped out of school early. When I met him it was clear that he was a sweet person who really liked people, but was dealing with a low IQ and some reasoning issues. The detective separated our defendant from the crowd and started questioning him. After a few minutes it was clear that the defendant was just giving answers that he thought the detective would want to hear. He really wanted to make the detective happy, instead of just dismissing the guy. The detective arrested him for giving false information. He had a few minor thefts on his record. Again, he had reasoning issues. So he was really looking at serious jail time because he talked to the police. Again, this dude just liked talking to people and didn't know better. He had no diagnosis or health records to back up any claim of mental deficiencies, and anything resembling that would cost money he didn't have or time in a state mental facility. He lived with a relative who was equally broke. His lawyer was contemplating a guilty plea because he'd lied directly to a police officer and admitted it. I left before the case got resolved. But it's the one I still think about. This guy was largely harmless and was likely going to spend at least some time in serious jail, where the outcome would likely have been very bad for him. The thing that stuck with me was how unnecessary it all was. It was suffering for literally no purpose. Putting him in jail was not going to magically give that guy better cognitive skills other than making him distrust people. A close relative was a judge in a pretty small town in the 80s. There was a case. Drug deal gone bad. I guess one guy went to his dealer's trailer. Guy planned to rob dealer. Not only take his drugs, but his money as well. Dealer picked up on that plan quickly and pulled out a gun. First guy pulled out his gun as well. Both died. Suicide by stupidity. Really, the families ended up suing each other for wrongful death. Relatives spent a couple of days going over the law before they arrived in court, each wanting to get rid of the other for money. Relative, while on the bench no less, said something to the effect of, "They both did society a favor by removing themselves from our society." Early 80s, not a chance for that statement to go viral the way it would now, but you can bet the week following the letters to the editor in the local paper blew up. I only include this because the prosecutor was laughing so hard he had to excuse himself from the room when the judge made the comment. MLMs are considered pyramid schemes in my country, and both are banned in order to protect consumers. It's a crime to establish an MLM. Public prosecution here got wind of an MLM operating and shut it down, closing up the premises and everything. My firm was hired by the MLM to defend their case and establish to the public prosecution that they should be able to continue to operate. I had to prep all the defenses while absolutely despising MLMs and thinking that they're run and operated by predatory pieces of shit. We had several high-up employees from the MLM's head office in the US fly halfway across the world to us multiple times for status update meetings, lasting 15 to 30 minutes or so, that could have literally been done over email or conference call. Nope. They just had so much money to burn off the backs of vulnerable people who have zero chance of succeeding in their business, that a gang of them would fly over every so often to ask, "So how's it going?" I thanked my lucky stars every time the public prosecution rejected one of our arguments, and eventually the MLM gave up and cleared out of the country. Never been so happy that my arguments were unsuccessful. Not a lawyer, but a lawyer's assistant. My boss asked me to falsify the signature of a recently dead man in order to have a will validated. In my country, when a person dies, it takes up to 4 days to have the act registered. And in that time frame my boss legalized a secret will in which one of the sons of the deceased would be substantially benefited. It was of course, her client. Way late, but I knew someone who worked on a morally disappointing case. Basically, a woman was sexually assaulted. It was obvious, the guy did it. The woman was clearly distraught and the guy just acted guilty. My friend said, from the bottom of his heart, he could just tell. Like the rest of the jury. But the case was years old. On top of her waiting to press charges. In the end the grand jury couldn't send it to court. Simply not enough evidence, it was all hearsay. The way my friend told it, the jury was extremely distraught. Lost trust in the system and the likes. They just felt so disgusted. Like they should send this guy to court. And they had the power to do so. But they just couldn't. I was in charge of a legal aid office for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. I had a custody case where the father was very abusive and manipulative. And the mother, my client, had a slew of serious challenges. Both as a result of the abuse and just because she lost the lottery. Mental health, physical health, financially, family circumstances, just everything. in the jurisdiction where this happened. The judge who was responsible for this case was, to put it bluntly, an abuser. The judge's way of addressing DV issues, unless they fit into a very narrow band of cases the judge considered real abuse, was to abuse the victims in court until they went away. So, because I had been around the block a few times with this judge by this point, I had an ethical responsibility to prepare my client for what would happen if we filed a custody petition to go for what she wanted. Not to try to convince her what she should do, but just to be sure she understood. When she decided what she wanted to do, what to expect. Awful conversation to have. Because a few things would almost certainly be true, the father would lawyer up aggressively and start making everything even more of a living hell ASAP. It would go to a trial, and every single tiny issue she had ever struggled with would be aired out in court, putting her in the worst possible light. And she would be hectored and bullied and browbeaten by the husband's lawyer and by the judge. She's a terrible mother. She was a terrible wife. Dad finally couldn't carry her anymore. So she made up abuse to get him back. She doesn't work. She can't provide for herself, let alone the child. She's crazy. She's lazy. Her family doesn't even believe her. Just the worst, most sordid perspective on anything. And the judge would eat it up. The morally challenging part wasn't, like, should I do what I can to help this person? It was what would actually be helpful here. If I strongly suspect that going through this process will be extremely harmful to her for little or no material gain. But I also believe that I'm good at my job and want her to know I'll go in there and go ham on her behalf. Every client wants to know whether they can get what they want. But lots of clients, especially in a DV setting, don't really have any sense of what is okay or fair to expect or want, either consciously or subconsciously. Lots of people are looking for a lawyer to tell them what they should do, because it's complicated and it's hard to make that call. For that reason, a lot of lawyers become comfortable saying no. I understand, but you don't want to do that because blah blah blah. Or, yes, we should immediately blah blah blah. Effectively making the decision for the client. But that wasn't my approach, and that kind of thinking really shouldn't be, in my opinion, anywhere near people who have experienced violence. So it fucking sucked trying to prepare a client to be able to make her own decision in an informed way when I knew, with certainty, that litigating the case would be opening the door to all kinds of abuse. I was born and raised Catholic, married into a very prominent Catholic family. I joined a firm that was representing sexual abuse victims. I initially stayed out because the bishop who was in charge of the bad priest married my wife and me. But the more I observed the case and his lying, I couldn't sit by. When the case was dismissed at the trial level, the partner asked me to write the appellate briefs because that was my forte. I did, and the dismissal was reversed and the church quickly settled. Highlight of my career and spiritual life. In some areas of law, you get a bit of everything. I'm in one of those areas. I do not do family law. But I had one case where an ex-husband and ex-wife were against each other. Both were completely fraudulent. Both were trying to use their young daughter against the other. One was a chronic cheater/opportunist, and the other was constantly high or drunk and constantly trying to access his former wife's financials. She was quite well off when they got together. This was not a divorce case. But due to the nature of the case, all attorneys involved were privy to the entire record of their divorce. I feel like our client edged out our opposition very minutely in being a slightly better person, but it was a hollow victory. I used to do a lot of enforcement court cases, where we would use liens and properties to cover losses on loans on behalf of our clients, banks and such. Had one case, where the debtor was very eager to talk about the debt and how he really wanted to repay our client according to the agreed repayment plan. How he was trying to come up with a way to get the money, etc. etc. The meeting dragged on for an hour. These cases usually took less than 10 minutes, since the debtor very rarely had any other way of repaying the loan. And he seemed very eager to tell me about why he was in debt in the first place. I finally asked him out of curiosity why he had taken out the debt. And it turned out his son, who was around my age, had terminal cancer. And he and his wife had sold everything they owned and took out huge loans with their house as security to provide him with the best possible treatment, and eventually hospice. And, as he said it, now my son is gone, but the debt is not. All I could do was warn him about the planned foreclosure 4 weeks later, if he did not find a way to repay as promised. Turned out, he did find a way to come up with the money. But I still think a lot about that case. My friend told me about a case where a bunch of 18-year-olds were drinking and of course one of them said hit me. The one who said hit me ended up hitting his head and dying. He is representing the dead boy's parents, who instigated the whole thing. NAL, but I followed this case up through the scouts and found it very interesting. I've posted about it a few times, from the perspective of the original defense trial lawyer. McCoy v. Louisiana, https://case.com/case/McCoy v. Louisiana 5. The summary of it is that this fellow McCoy killed some family members and the evidence was overwhelming. McCoy hires a trial attorney and tells him he does not want to plead guilty. Not only that, McCoy tells his lawyer he wants to argue that he was out of the state at the time and it was crooked cops that killed his family. In Louisiana, they have the death penalty, but it is used in first-degree murder cases. The lawyer wanted McCoy to admit to the commission of the crime but argue that McCoy didn't meet the mental requirements for first-degree murder and therefore keep him off death row. Essentially, the lawyer would not contest his client did the act but rather contest that his client had the guilty mind sufficient for first degree. Of course, it would mean the best outcome is a second-degree murder conviction which carries life in prison, but it would take the death penalty out of play. Regardless of what you believe about the death penalty or this particular case, it is the job of the defense lawyer to act in the best interest of the client, but this client was making it very difficult. The client did not want to die but also refused to proceed with a strategy that would possibly make that a reality. The client's strategy would essentially put himself on death row. The lawyer, faced with this dilemma, decided to essentially admit the elements against his client's wishes in an attempt to take the death penalty off the table. The client would blurt out things like, "My lawyer sold me out. It was the crooked cops," and took the stand in his own defense with conspiracy theories. The trial turned out to be a circus. Needless to say, McCoy was convicted and sentenced to death. Eventually, through appeals it made it to the SCOTUS where the conviction was overturned and McCoy is waiting his new trial where it seems pretty evident he will be convicted and sentenced to death again, but the point is from the perspective of the defense lawyer, it must have been an internal struggle between trying to do what is best for them versus following the strategy the client wants you to proceed with. I defended a man accused of abusing his GF and it was the third time he'd been charged in the same relationship. It was obvious he was guilty but the GF essentially was under his spell and stopped cooperating. Obvious pattern of some pretty serious abuse. Not me but a friend from university who was slashes, and I don't mean this pejoratively, a do-gooder looking to make the world a better place. A few years after the fact he told me about one of his earlier cases as a public defender. His client was a clean-cut, good-looking kid from a lower middle-class family up on a public mischief charge, vandalism. He brought the kid a clean dress shirt and tie for his initial court appearance. When the kid took off his t-shirt to change into it, big old Nazi eagle tattoo on his back. According to my friend, after helping get the kid community service, he had to go into the men's room and vomit. I worked 7 months at a criminal defense firm while I was at university. 2 cases stayed with me and are reasons I will never practice in criminal law. The first was a teenage boy who, egged on by his friends, forced his 5-year-old brother, while filming, to give him fellatio. The client came in with his parents and showed zero remorse. He didn't care. He was asked how he felt about it and he said he didn't know. The real kicker to me was the 5-year-old was in the lobby outside while they interviewed and they were all still in the same house. The client was given some offender classes and let go. Mitigating factors were considered in his sentencing that meant he was barely punished. The next was what I feel to be a huge miscarriage of justice. An adult male committed horrific domestic violence, strangling his partner, throwing her through a shower screen, beating her, and the woman's child heard this and called police because she was in no state to do anything. Turns out this is the second woman he had done the exact same thing to. The first time he received court-ordered anger management and domestic violence classes. This time he received the same and a suspended sentence. The client was so blasé about it, he was advised he might go to jail and should get his affairs in order. He ignored that and laughed in his solicitor's face, while his father, who was paying his legal fees, just hung his head and didn't know what to do. I don't know why the client didn't go to jail. An act of God meant the female prosecutor didn't ask for a custodial sentence. Defended a guy charged with child molestation. Not the challenging part. He clearly did not do it. He was however an admitted and convicted child molester from an earlier case. Yuck. But everyone is entitled to a defense, and this guy clearly didn't do this one. So, why challenging? He so clearly didn't do this one that as the case developed, the prosecutor realized he didn't do it. But this was in the last 2 months or so before the prosecutor's re-election. In a roundabout, didn't say it, but clearly conveyed it manner, prosecutor communicated in effect, leave it alone until after the election and it will go away. Client was in jail and couldn't make bail. We let the case delay. Election passed and a couple of days later charges were dismissed. It sucked, but had we tried to fight it, client might well have been convicted by a jury since he had a previous conviction and he could have went away for over 10 years for something he didn't do. The professor of a business law class told my class this story. At one time, he was the attorney that represented my hometown government on legal matters. There was once a case where police officers from my hometown were chasing a suspect. The suspect opened fire and they returned fire. After it was all said and done, they realized that one of the bullets from the cop's gun had inadvertently killed an innocent bystander. The family of the bystander sued. Apparently she was transient and a drug addict and had been in the area to try and score drugs. The family's attorney was asking for millions in restitution. My professor said he was scared shitless about having to go before a jury and state that the family of the woman did not deserve such a high amount of restitution because, being a drug addict, the woman's life really had no monetary value to begin with. Thankfully, the city and the family settled out of court. I can only imagine how shitty my professor would have felt if he had actually been compelled to make that argument to the jury. Who wants to say to a jury and to family in the court gallery that someone's life had no value? Video editor, not a lawyer. I make lots of tapes for lawyers, harsh depositions, evidentiary stuff, getting to the good stuff in a 12-hour surveillance tape. I have even had to pixelate everyone's face but the suspects in hospital surveillance tape due to HIPAA. Sometimes the state will ask me to recover very bad audio from criminal investigations or see if I can see fraudulent editing on a tape, debunk a James O'Keefe copycat. I don't see the whole case and never know the outcomes. I just get a ton of raw input. Video can lie and so can mine. A thing I felt bad about was working for the defense in a civil suit. New worker had his legs crushed at a loading dock. We get our cameras and are working for the company to show how the loading dock is supposed to be done and all their safety equipment working. They have their best guy to demo the stuff. The old SALT employee. He can't make the safety latches work at 2 of the 3 loading docks. The one that does work doesn't work reliably. It is obvious they never use this stuff. But the video is edited and it looks like the company and safety equipment are slick and functional, run by the most seasoned pros. I worked defense before becoming a prosecutor 2 years ago. The hardest case was a guy who was accused of molesting his family friend's daughters, who were 5 at the time. He hired us. He didn't want to register as a sex offender and didn't want to do any jail time. We knew he did it. We heard his interview with the police. Yet we had to defend him to the best of our ability. We trawled through the family, friends' Facebook accounts, finding sexually suggestive photos to show that the kids learned this on their own. We said they were coached by their vindictive grandmother. It felt disgusting and repugnant. It was our job, but damn, it left a bad taste in my mouth. I left and became a domestic violence and sexual assault prosecutor, which I still do. Going to get downvoted to shit for this because of who we were hired to defend. But one of my co-workers, fellow attorney, was hired by a man in possession of